So now I'd like to ask our panelists to join me here on the stage for our discussion.
Yeah.
So we've arrived at the final leg of our conference, having successfully held it for 2 days now. Now I have to say that the minister's right. In truth, I left the Sauerland region because back then already we realized that there wouldn't be promising projects. I stayed in the Rhineland-Palatinate, actually. I was very successful here. It's a pleasure to be the host here of that panel discussion, or to facilitate this. In the left, Martin Ries from Stuttgart, an expert on organic agriculture. Then he's from the Alsace. He's vice president of Biodevin. Then here, Klaus Burmeister of the Heidlinger wine estate in the Kraichgau region, and Uwe Hoffmann, who has just been mentioned, founding member of Ecovin. And his doctoral thesis, he worked on phosphonates. Now, let me just look back to the 80s and 90s, and then I'm going to give you the floor. Now, your doctoral thesis, why did you think it was necessary to do research on this subject? So how did this come about? How did it develop? Where were potassium phosphonates used? And you traveled widely, of course, because you worked as an international consultant, didn't you? Well, thank you very much, Ralph. Randolph already said a lot that we were going to talk about. It's a never-ending story. And this applies to my life, too, my career. Now, every now and then I thought, well, now I finally made it. I have now succeeded in making sure that the regulation would include potassium phosphonates. But let's see, perhaps on the third attempt we'll be successful. Now, it was great to meet Georg Till here, because back in '84, when the Rhine-Hesse Organic Viticulture Association was formed, we looked into the question of what we could do. And very early on, we had this discussion in Germany already, when we discussed the directive, well, the use of copper, 3 kilos of copper. At the EU level, there was no limit imposed on the use of copper in organic farming, none whatsoever. Then, step by step, and as we heard, this was reduced down to 8 kilos, then 6 kilos, and then down to 4 kilos. So we started out with 3 kilos. And at that time, Georg had the idea that there was a substance called potassium phosphonate, a aluminium phosphatile, or phosphathyl, that was launched back then. So phosphoric acid is actually the active ingredient in this agent, but at the time, the EU, of course, didn't deal with this because any manufacturer, and as we saw was the case with the magic potion picture, in my doctoral thesis at the Mariannenauer, I had an extreme year that I experienced, so I mixed up my own formulation. I got some phosphoric acid and potassium hydroxide, so an acid and a base, and I mixed that together. So I thought, let's mix that rather than the lye and the gas to neutralize it. But in the lab setting, that created quite a stir amongst my colleagues. So, but that is how my experimentation started. Now, I thought how to best, set it all up. So if you look back over history, organic farming or viticulture in Germany, Ecovin, was founded in 1985. And there was a range of different initiatives that were created in different German states. And people at the time didn't even talk about peronospora. People, for them, it was non-existent. It just didn't figure at all. So back in 85, 86, of course, there were all sorts of trials, even applying compost tea, and then the year 1987 happened. Now, that was a year that was very, very special. Nothing worked. Even with 3 kilos of copper, you didn't make any progress. A lot of estates that had just made the switch to organic practices you were brought to the brink. And we just heard it in 1987, or 97, sorry, that was the next year of extremes. Then, the year 2006, 2010, 2016. You know, the intervals are getting ever shorter, the intervals between these disaster years, from 10 to 6 to 5 years. By now, it's every 4 or 5 years that we're witnessing these extreme penumbra years. That is given our climatic context here. And that is what makes everything so difficult. Now, our colleague explained the whole history just now. Now, something's happened in between. Back in 2007, for example, a conference was held in Rufach, or rather in Brissach, where together with our French colleagues, we formed an organic wine export group that also looked into this subject matter. And this group arrived at the conclusion that there could be different approaches. For those countries which needed or wanted to have potassium phosphonate, you would approve it with some limitations that were necessary. And those countries that at the time still used or permitted 6 kilos of copper, that amount would still be approved. Now, let me move on to Christophe. Now, in France, you permit 6 kilos of copper, 28 kilos of copper in 7 years. In the past, it was 30 kilos in 5 years. So you can actually apply more copper than we can. So there still is a need, however, for you to think about alternatives because, of course, the years with higher disease pressure also are becoming ever more frequent, right? Well, thank you. I'll try to give my answer in German. I am a wine grower from the Alsace region, and I've had my family, well, actually, I took over a family-run vineyard 30 years ago. I didn't want to apply chemicals, so I decided to really work my vineyard organically from the start. So I experimented with in different ways. Of course, I worked with copper. And at the outset, there was no limitation on the use of copper. You could use as much as you wanted. So then, of course, the use of copper was limited from 8 down to 6 kilos, and it became ever more difficult because some years were too extreme. There was a lot of rain, and there are regions in France where the situation is getting more difficult all the time. Last year, I had some colleagues who worked their vineyards organically, but they sprayed several times during the year, up to 8 kilos of copper in total. Now, of course, this limit applies, but on the other hand, in France, for years, we have undertaken efforts in France to only use plants and to use the organic farming calendar in order to use less in the way of pesticides or fungicides. And now since 30 years, on average, I've been using 1.8 kilo of metal copper per hectare per year, even though last year I had to increase that amount to 3.5 kilos. So to cut a long story short, it's possible, but not every year. So what is important for what we're discussing today is that the position in France, or the standpoint in France, is that our history is so different. It's different from the history as it's just been explained to you. I think as the president of Biodiva, it would be interesting to know the whole history and the insights and outs of it. Why? Because in France, even today, we don't have, or, people don't want to have potassium phosphonators. That is what some people say. They say we'll lose our organic certification. So it would be great to really hear more about it. That would really help the organic wine producers. Do you see what I mean? That is why I think we should really strengthen our dialogue. Well, that's precisely what we're doing through IFOAM, which is our umbrella organization, the International Federation of Organic Agriculture. Now, to be very specific, of course we try to do this. We met in Roufach, as I said, or in Frick. We also met in Breisach. And we compared books on our information. I came up with an expert report on the natural origins of these substances. And now with the new situation report that we have, that was published in 3 languages, in German, English, and French, to make sure that everybody would have access to this information. And as part of the Organic Wine Export Group that has just been reconvened, we are going to continue exactly this discussion. Now, I'll just leave it at that. What is important is that you discuss this on a neutral platform and that the discussion is strictly fact-based and objective. I think, Christoph, you promised you were going to show a slide or a diagram in a minute. Okay, we'll show that later. Martin, now, Randolph just explained the situation. Since 2013, we didn't have PP, potassium phosphonates anymore. So what are the effects now? Now, we can see the effects this has out there in the different estates and vineyards. 2013 now really hit us very hard. We didn't have the tools. We realized then in wet years it was very hard to produce wine, especially in Central Europe. This is where we bore the brunt of it. And the southern European countries don't see the need for this. Now, I have to say, when it comes to crop protection, where we have culture-related or culture-specific approvals, the situation in organic farming, it's quite different. A substance is approved or it's listed in the positive meaning. That means it can be used for viticultural purposes. And when it comes to potassium phosphonate, and that is what the southerners are worried about, they will say, well, if it's permitted in viticulture, it could also be applied for fruit growing, for example. So the discussion could be much more broad-based. So that is the risk. So from the point of view of the organic grower associations and authorities whose task it is to implement the legislation, you will have to see that if you include this substance, you have to think about its applicability in other areas too. Now, we talked about a big trial in the past because a substance that must not be used was actually used in organic farming areas. But the organic legislation is quite clear about this. They said that certain parts of the produce could not be marketed as organic products. The area that was used actually had to be switched back to normal practices. And then there was a question on permanent cultivation. Now, could you change back, for example? And it depended on the residue that was found, for example, on the woody part of the vine. But it really entails a whole rigmarole of different things, really. So we had this discussion at the very beginning. So if areas need to be reclassified, so if certain areas have been farmed conventionally rather than organically, what does that mean for the whole producer or estate? Now, these are questions that we're not really aware of as practitioners, but these are questions that would automatically be asked by the regulator or by officials. But of course, they don't help us really to make headway here as practitioners. Now, of course, organic viticulture really has been a success story. If you look back over the last 10 to 20 years, we've been on the up and up. Area under vine that have been worked organically have increased all the time. Now, how big are you? Since when have you been an organic operation? Well, we are situated at the Kraichgau region, the beautiful Kraichgau. So we have calcium-rich soils. Now, I've been in charge since 1995, and since 2008, I've been in charge of 2 estates. Actually, it's a family-run enterprise, and my son has now joined it. He's a managing director for both estates together with me. Now, I'm the son of a wine grower. I grew up in a vineyard, basically, and very quickly I felt that what we're doing and the way we worked wasn't quite right. So I then attempted the first cautious steps, and then we took the logical conclusion to switch over to organic viticulture in, well, around 2008 or 10 or so, since 2014. Then we have been organic, and since a couple of years we have been Demeter certified.
Das heißt 30%.
I think it was around 100 hectares or so. And, well, of course, there are challenges that come with this for organic farming. And we started out, of course, working with potassium phosphonate when it was available to us, and it was easy back then. So in 2016, however, that was such a shock. It really pulled away the carpet from underneath our feet. Now, you said, you know, the practitioners don't really understand how the administration works, but if you're out there in the vineyard and you struggle, if you try to do your best in a difficult situation, I mean, with the steep slope viticulture, sometimes, you know, doing plant protection can be perilous indeed, life-threatening even. You work even on Saturdays. I mean, if at least it had had an effect, if at least that had helped us to salvage our harvest, and at the end of the year, we only actually had a harvest or a yield of 30%. You know, this is not viable. Now, for a large estate, of course, this is still, of course, a challenge, because it's not just up to the management or whether they really like and support organic practices, but you have to include the support of your staff too. And that is where things get difficult. I mean, and this is a momentum you want to keep up. And that is why I find it so difficult to understand that we're not allowed to use potassium phosphonate. I mean, for me, this would be the key. That ensures a future for us, because 2024 was such a bad year, it's not a year we would survive again. Now, initially people said it brought wine growers to its limits. Well, I don't think that's true. Actually, we went beyond our limits. It was more than we could take. And even our reserves have been used up. So we cannot make do without effective sprays. And, you know, applying plant or crop protection 19 times with minimal effect, whether that really is meaningful, I mean, that is something that we really call into question. Something we cannot understand. Now, the situation in France is not easy. You had huge perro damage in the Burgundy region, and I think in the Alsace, and I think in the Champagne. So you use a little bit more copper. What alternatives can you resort to? You talked about some ongoing projects. You said that you did projects in 10 wine-growing regions with a couple of wine growers. Perhaps you could briefly talk about this, and we've got a slide on this too. Yes, thank you. As I said before, I mean, the mildew problem is a big one. Now, whether you spray 10 times or 15 times, and when you work on steep slopes, it can be dangerous work indeed. So for your staff, that's also really difficult to take. So I try to do as much proactively as possible. That is, I try to use the good copper. It all depends on what copper you use, and then you spray your copper before or after the rain. That is also important to decide. And for 28 years, I've been working on plants. And I have to say, for 30 years, or 30 years ago, the research base wasn't really very robust regarding organic practices. Now, slowly but surely, this is changing. And just in January, we had a colloquium. If you can see it here, perhaps, on my slide. This shows you the research in France. And as the minister said, we brought research and practitioners together. And that is precisely what we did in France for the last 2 or 3 years. As I said, we should do more of this. And we should also cooperate with Switzerland and Germany. Perhaps that will be an opportunity to learn more about each other, to work together, to develop a better understanding, really, and with the other participants too. I mean, even talking about potassium phosphonate, where it's used and where it's accepted, to learn more about this. I'm not sure whether research has been done on the subject, but we had our colloquium and we studied different plants. We are 244 wine growers from 10 regions in France. They all joined in. And we conducted interviews on all the problems they encountered. We asked them what they sprayed and how they sprayed, and how they use, for example, different herbs. For example, horsetail or dandelion tea, for example. So even in difficult years, I managed to get by with 1.8 kilos of copper per year, so it can be done. Not always. It's difficult, of course. You have to understand the technology, but I think we have to continue to work with these products. And if it's possible, perhaps, to use potassium phosphonate, if it gets approved in Germany, then we should look at that. I don't think you should, go for an all-or-nothing approach. You have to think hard about all the different options out there and take a pragmatic view. Well, we too have excellent experience with dandelion liquors and other things. 1.8 or 1.9 kilo of copper, that is something that we were able to use too. But, in the difficulties, that doesn't help. And also, it should be our strategy to think further afield on how we can reduce the use of copper more. And also, in order to reduce the frequency of spraying. We talked so much about fungus-resistant grapes, but we did not talk about the soil. But the soil is full of potential regarding plant resilience and robust health. But, if we take our 4-ton tractors compacting the soil all the time, and if we do the same when we apply the crop protection and the plant protection, again, we have to move across the vineyard. So all of this, of course, is not good for the soil. We destroy it. In other words, we're not just playing with the health of the vineyard, but also our yield and our work on the soil too. Now, you could even say we're infringing on the soil protection law, even though there are some very good alternatives available. So I think we should really think more broadly. And there are so many different building blocks that go towards this that we could work on, but we should not exclude anything from the beginning. Something that really meets all the requirements that we have from an organic practice point of view. And we'll have to find solutions. Thank you very much for mentioning this, the soil, because I believe this was really what started the discussion in Germany, the effect of copper on the soil. Now, I don't really want to harp on this subject. Actually, we could organize a separate conference on this subject alone. That is why since 2011, we installed the Copper Task Force, or why we began to talk about reducing copper, and talked about this every year. Now, but as you just said, one positive effect of phosphonate, whether potassium or not, is that it doesn't have a negative impact on the microorganisms in the soil. The effect on the soil is even positive, especially on mycorrhiza fungi, which strengthen or fortify the resistance of our grapes. So we have a dual effect, not just because of the effect of the agent or the substance on the plant, but as Randolph said, it is a system-induced resistance that you produce, and that is what we're hoping to achieve, of course. That is what we're hoping to achieve with these plant-based extracts, which do not have this fungicidal effect, but they are triggering a reaction on the side of the plant so that the plant can identify the damage early on or defend against it directly. And that is an effect we achieve with potassium phosphonates after a very short time. So don't go for the all-or-nothing approach. If we approve potassium phosphonate, we cannot replace copper. That is not the intention behind it. That's not what we're talking about. We can only reduce the use of copper this way if conditions permitting. And that is what the field trials have shown too, that of course all wine growers have an interest in reducing the use of copper. But if you have to spray 14, 15 or even 20 times, of course, then it's too much. I totally agree with you. This is preferable to having to spray 20 times with a 4-ton tractor. But we worked on the problem of copper in the soil. And viticulture, the 244 wine growers, together with them, we looked at all this. And they, practice viticulture different ways, some of them organically and in different ways. So we looked at how often the 4 tons actually traversed the vineyards. And as part of a project where I'm a partner, the rows between the vines are too narrow and the site is too steep. It's only 400 kilos there, and actually our soil analyses are different compared to others where the mechanical processing load is higher. In other words, there's so many parameters that you need to consider. And I believe the problem is not between potassium phosphonate or copper. You have to include everything, taking a pragmatic approach. All parameters are important. But the chief thing is that we have to manage to ensure that wine growers can produce good quality wines.
Well, let me go back to where we are at the moment at the process, within the process. Well, the question with Klaus Burmeier was, what are you doing and what are the results? That's always been the subject of the discussion. The minister was in favor of potassium phosphonate right from the start. We had quite a few meetings in Brussels about it, where often, though, we were rejected, and often the reservation was about residue. And when you look at the results, you have to see that one of the most frequently found residues is the decomposition product of potassium phosphonate. And this goes for all fresh plant food from any region. So these research results from outside of viticulture were always used as an argument against it. And that's one point of view. And another point of view, which is a response to whether we can expect potassium phosphonate to be listed, and the clear answer is no. This will be a non-approved agent with all of the consequences that we saw in 2016. And we also wondered whether we could show some civil disobedience here in Baden-Württemberg and just reject the European laws. But European law, which is directly applicable in member states, cannot be circumvented. So this will always be a violation of the integrity of the biodirective. And then let me just say this kind of now I'll just have a concluding round. Mr. Burmacher, you always said that without an application, there'd be no chance to have potassium phosphonate listed. And I was pleased to see that the BOVV, together with the German Viticulture Association, applied for it being listed. And now we are discussing partial groups within the European context. This is about ICTOP. Just to explain this, ICTOP is the expert body for organic agriculture in Europe. And they will give their expert opinion based on the evaluation of facts and also based on the background of the members of the body. We have to be honest about that. And the European Commission, which includes the member states, takes the final decision on whether an agent is listed or not. So now we are just at the stage of the expert appraisal, and their opinion will be a recommendation which will not be binding for the Commission. If the Commission is subject to political pressure and therefore comes to a different conclusion, they can also decide contrary to the recommendation by the experts. And this is the phase that we're at. And particularly the administration and the associations have been informing European bodies because there is a lot of misunderstandings, prejudice, and just simply lack of knowledge. And if you want a majority, of course, you need a majority from other wine-growing regions. That's the challenge that we're faced with. Fact-based documents in short, medium, and long versions. And this is a message for the forum. We also need a European campaign to use potassium phosphonate as a solution. And you need to do that at every level that you can. And this is not dependent on the number of hectares, but on the number of people who will support the solution. So we're in the process. Communication is a key to find solutions, and we can really promote this by informing and lobbying. Well, thank you very much for this excellent summary. Communication is always key. So I've been part of the process for 13 years with just a break of 3 years, as many of you may know. But I think that we've never been as close as this. In 2014, the facts were different. When it was rejected in 2019, it was different. But now we have the VitiFit project on its final leg, and we've been able to generate a lot of new knowledge. And we have excellent reports that will be able to contribute to the documentation. And so it's now been sent to Brussels, and there will always be people opposed to it, also amongst organic farmers or wine growers. There is a compromise dating back to 2014 because we had different copper approvals. At the time, there was no copper account, but we had 30 kilos over 3 years, or 15 kilos in 5 years in Germany and Austria. And based on that difference, the EFOAM wine expert found a compromise which said that potassium phosphonate should be subject to approval in those countries, but should only be used in those countries where there is a lower level of copper being used. And this is often quoted. Unfortunately, however, interpreted incorrectly. And if then a wrong interpretation goes to the wrong person via the wrong channel, then the impression is this creates the impression that it depends on the political party that we are with. But actually, we talk to members of parliament, of European Parliament, to local parliaments, etc. We have to find a European solution where various democratic parties have a consensus that supports our industry. We have 10 minutes left, so maybe we can just open the floor for maybe questions from the audience. Are there any questions at this point? Thank you for this interesting discussion. Well, there's one point that we hear about a lot when we talk amongst practitioners. Well, there are different burdens across Europe. And so the more southern wine-growing regions are not really interested in using potassium phosphonate in organic farming because actually the problem that we have might be a competitive advantage for them in the south. So, of course, well, that's something that we hear about a lot. Is this just a rumor, or is it actually a competitive advantage? Well, we discussed this yesterday. Maybe one of you could answer this because we talked about it yesterday. I don't have a vested interest. I am part of the administration, and very clearly, we can't exclude the possibility that apart from convictions and scientists, there are also strategic aspects at play. In Europe, of course, we have the force of the argument and of the facts, but just like in any democracy, we also have the fact that sometimes majorities find solutions that are good or maybe that are not so good. And so we can assume that there are also aspects that are not based on the scientific facts that play a role here. So it's important not just to look at your own interests, but also to look at the interests of others. And the challenge here is to find solutions that are good for us, but that are also good for others, so that these kind of arguments can be disqualified. Let me just add, of course, this discussion is being led, but particularly in export countries, there is a worry that the discussion about potassium phosphonate, particularly because of the residues, could restrict the possibilities of exports. And we just heard Eurofin Granada has carried out 130,000 potassium phosphonate analyses, not just for wine, but for all kinds of crops and agricultural produce. from legumes to fruit and everything. And we find phosphonates. But the question is, where does it come from? Where is it being generated if it's not being used? And this is a point that is which says that maybe under certain conditions, it is naturally formed by the microorganisms in the soil and taken up by the plant. This is particularly true for legumes. And so the discussion about residue is becoming absurd here if this is actually a natural part of the plant. I heard that in Pakistan they found it also in small holdings in Pakistan where they don't even have the money to buy that kind of plant protection product. So we don't really know yet whether this is residues or just part of the plant. And so let's be open and transparent so that we can get potassium phosphonate listed. This copper is extended every 7 years. Others are extended every 15 years. So this will be reviewed again anyway. Are there any more questions? There's one by Andolf. Well, maybe let me just add something. When you say about it being part of the plant, this is an important point. If the scientific knowledge allows this, so talking about what's a residue, where does it come from, and what should we accept, should be a wider discussion. We use calcium bicarbonate, and this is not a residue, but of course this is shown in the mesh, and copper is on also a residue on the grapes and in the mash. And so I think we have to have an open conversation about this. Well, we often heard that when we talked about copper, it was the discussion was more about the fact that there's no awareness about of this fact of copper levels. And we have all kinds of documents that say that copper is not a problem at all. But if we raise this awareness that we all want to move forward together to the benefit of organic viticulture in Europe, and that we suggest something for good reason and with a scientific basis, we have to work together. Our colleagues in our Champagne and Alsace also will also be in trouble if we have another difficult year. Thank you, Randolph. We have 2 minutes left, so maybe we can just have a final statement by each of you. Well, I'm also a spokesperson for Demeter Viticulture, and I'm kind of like the potassium phosphonate proponent. So I've been dealing with or looking at the topic for a long time, and the survey led to a petition for potassium phosphonate, both for organic and for non-organic viticulture, just to find out what the general mood is. The petition has been signed by 1,200 wine growers. And this covers the more than 90% of the area covered by VDP, where the wine growers have a clear commitment where they say that if they can't use potassium phosphonate, they don't see a future for themselves in organic viticulture. I think this is a very strong statement. Maybe you can show us all where the source is, where this can be found. But we need all of your signatures. We also have a lot of colleagues from abroad who have signed this. So let's do this. We have an opportunity to get approval for potassium phosphonate. Let's talk together at an international of two. Let's have a dialogue, because organic viticulture still has to be economical and has to be financially sustainable. Well, we have exchanged everything. We have shown all of the scientific results. So I would expect a scientifically well-founded evaluation to take place in EGTOP. And this should give us the opportunity to use potassium phosphonate as an addition to copper and the other approved crop protection agents. And this should be able to contribute to securing the livelihoods of wine growers in Germany and in other regions where we're very much affected by climate change. And this should help organic viticulture to grow in the long term and not be in trouble every time there's a difficult year. And then opt to go back to non-organic viticulture. Yes, I think the work that you do with VitiFit is good and right, not just for Germany, but for organic wine growers across Europe. I think we still have to communicate more. Potassium phosphonate is not an easy solution, but we should do everything we can to work together to use as little copper and potassium phosphonate, but we have to secure our future. And so that we are economically viable and produce good wines. The last 10 years were characterized by a discussion where many knew what's not possible. I would like to see the opposite of that. And I think we've contributed a lot to that. Communication has to continue. So advocating solutions that work. When I speak to some to wine growers in the difficult years, I can feel how stressed they are, how hard they work for a result that is, in the end, still unsatisfactory. So I would like to see solutions for us, and we also, for that to happen, we also need a European solution, and that go beyond 2026. So we are optimistic, and hopefully we can now our scientific basis can help move things forward. I think it's not just the wine growers that are pushed to their limits, but the associations are also pushed to their limits. And even though they do this important work of representing the industry, well, I would like to thank everyone for being here. It's been a great conference. Anyone who's still free next week on the 10th of April, we will have a sustainability forum in Heilbronn in collaboration with organic associations, and which is a great program. So if you want, you can still join us. There are flyers outside. So thank you very much to all of you. And to the audience, it's been a great conference, a great project. And I'm glad we're all part of this. Thank you very much.